All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to the first of the 2021 Agile discussion groups. And we talked about this a little bit last year, where we're going to basically be talking about updates to the Scrum Guide. But Nitin had some materials that he had used in the past about previous Scrum Guides. So we felt that it would be really interesting if everybody had a chance to actually see how the Scrum Guide has evolved and then take it from there. And what we want to do is keep this relatively interactive. And what that means is we want you guys to ask questions if you have any, and we'll go forward. So just a real quick intro. If you've been on these sessions before, I'm the director of Agile Learning for the PMI New Jersey chapter, and we've been running these discussion groups for quite some time now, and they've been very successful. Currently, I'm working for a large bank, and I'm a Scrum Master where I have 4 teams, 2 in Poland, 1 in the US, and 1 in India. And I'm also an Agile coach where I do a lot of training across the organization in each of the locations as well. And with that, Nitin, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. And Bob, are you sharing? Just want to make sure. Hi, I'm Nitin Khanna. You probably heard me on many of these calls as well. I'm an Agile coach as well, with a string of acronyms behind me. I'm a bit of a Scrum nut. While there are many flavors of the Agile umbrella, Scrum is the preference of choice and still the most widely used. I've done adoptions, transformations, worked with teams just starting up to teams that are struggling. I've seen hyper-productive teams that are just zooming away and all of a sudden something happens and they tank. So between Bob and I, we're both palindromes. Um, we can spell our name backwards, so you're gonna have different stories, different perspectives, but we believe, it's one philosophy and this works.
And I apologize, everyone. Zoom tangled me up. It will not let me share my screen. I guess they added some security or something. Let me
Oh
see
boy.
if they'll let me share PowerPoint. I know. Uh,
Are you a host?
yeah,
Can
but
host?
it will not let me share because of some security thing. It wants me to completely quit Zoom. Let me see if it let me share PowerPoint.
It
Can
says
you guys see it?
you are
We're good.
sharing,
We
yes.
can see it.
Okay, I tried to
Yeah.
share my whole desktop. It wouldn't let me do that. So that's where we're at. So again, I apologize for that, but that's sometimes technology kind of gets you that way. So with that, let's talk about the agenda. Go ahead, Nathan.
Right. So broadly speaking, we wanted to also give some time for some QA towards the end. So we're thinking, it's gonna be 30 or 45 minutes, and then we'll also maybe take a few comments in the chat if you want to as well. We're talking a little bit about Scrum timelines and their evolution. Just like the PMBOK is a publication that gets published and updated, Scrum has also evolved. We'll see that. There is the annual State of Agile survey, which is 14 years in the running, talking about what's happening in the industry, a lot of participants globally, and we'll see something insightful there. If you've attended any of the interactive sessions I've had, there is a guess the sport game. Because we're virtual, we won't play that, but we'll talk a little bit about the importance of rules and why they matter in Scrum. And this is always interesting to me. Is it Scrum, screaming out loud, or just Scrum in title case? Is it a methodology? Is it a framework? This is always a popular discussion. Some tips, and I'll be a little vague about that. It's not the 5% or 10% you calculate after a meal, sometimes dining out. And some of the artifacts. You may have heard of the release planning or the burn down, velocity. These are terms that are so often used, but have they disappeared? Where are they? What happened? And we'll talk a little bit about the Scrum Master role because the Scrum Master also is a coach and is also someone who's helping the organization. And let's see what happens there. And most certainly, the recent edits came about in 2020 and 2021, and I have some psychic predictions as well that'll come about. So next slide, please, Bob. So here's the timeline. 1986, we had the Harvard Business Review, the new product development game. It's very popular. You can download this. It's an easy read by Taguchi and Nanko, who are considered the grandfathers of Scrum by Dr. Jeff Sutherland. And they just had an interesting observation in the time of competition or distress. Which are the organizations or entities that will thrive? And the gist of it was those companies that were nimble. And it seems that those teams that were coordinated so well, where they could hand off things to each other, it's almost like the game of rugby. Use that reference very interestingly there. They would survive as compared to a lot of the traditional waterfall or those organizations that took many a months to get something in the hands of the customer. In 96, we had the UPLA conference and pages that were released and spoken about, and the Scrum techniques were more visible and started to formalize. In 2001, which isn't really too long ago if you think about it, was just the Agile Manifesto signatories coming together. These were people with a traditional developer background. They met at a ski resort in Utah and said, let's give this more shape. And from that, we had certifications. The Scrum Alliance was formed. We have these popular courses with the Certified Scrum Master still being the most popular. And then the Scrum Guide got updated. 2007, 9, 10, 11, again, 13, 16, 17. A lot of these, interestingly, are not available as historic artifacts you could access. I do have copies, I do have screenshots, and I think I'm fortunate to have just kind of probed into the subtle language that's there. 2020, November, it was updated again, so we'll touch upon that, and Bob's also got some good observations there. We always like to add our name there. Who knows, in the world of IT, we might become famous one day, and this will be a historic artifact. So we'll say, yeah, Nitin and Bob presented in 2021 at the virtual event. And certainly, my psychic prediction, I'll tell you right now, is that in 2022, the Scrum Guide will be updated. That's as good as I can get, folks, because typically they update every 2 years. So Scrum does evolve, a bit of a timeline to it, and this is what it looks like. Next one. So the 14th annual State of Agile survey, again, 14 years into running, and just one screenshot and one snapshot, what's being used out there and which is the one that's the most popular, and that remains to be Scrum at about 58%. Scrumban is somewhat of a hybrid using Kanban and Scrum. There are two interpretations to this, and that's at 10%. People are doing hybrid things. The Scrum XP or extreme programming is at 8% as well. So that's a lot of information in the graph that there could be people doing variations of Scrum. And then you have Kanban and Lean Startup, extreme programming as well. So that's why Scrum, we're talking more about Scrum today. Next slide, Bob. So here I'm going to have you use your imaginations for just a moment. And this is an exercise you can actually facilitate with your team members. These could be team members that are already doing Scrum or those that need to be introduced to Scrum. And for fun, you could even do this with kids if you're trying to establish some sort of rules in the house. I'm at a stage where I've got a 2-year-old and a 9-year-old, and sometimes rules are important. So here's what I do. I give out cards to people, or if you want to use a virtual Trello board nowadays, and I say, hey, think of a sport and write down as many rules you can think of for that sport. For example, rule 1 says you can't hit below the belt without a penalty. Rule 2, you can punch your opponent. Rule 3, you can't bite your opponent's ear. And 4, there's a ref who can stop the game at any point. Take about 5 minutes, don't overthink it. And anybody want to guess this out very quickly? There's a quick opportunity to unmute yourself and mute or put it in the chat.
Boxing.
Boxing, that's it. And I bet you would have all gotten it. And yeah, I see boxing all over in the chat. Simple, right? This is something you can clearly identify with given a set of rules. So moving on, in the next slide, if I were to have every one of you to have picked an individual sport and have written it in this deck of cards and just exchange it, you could do this easily in a room, or if you're using a Trello board, just have people read what's in your column of cards. Would this be easy? Would it be hard? What do you think, Bob?
I think it would be really hard.
You think it'd be hard? You know, we got tripped up. There were times people were saying, that's basketball. And somebody says, no, it's not basketball. And then there'd be these colorful arguments. How can it not be basketball with all these rules? And he says, no, it's college basketball. There's a difference there. Like, oh, what's the difference? And then you'd start talking about the different rules within that. And somebody would say, oh, wait a minute, that's Taekwondo or that's karate. And there'll be some flavor of martial arts. And again, people would try to figure this out. Usually most people in the room get that. Now, going forward, to make it a little bit more complicated in the next slide, if you were to mix these up somehow, say, okay, you have a set of rules for a sport. Now, why don't you just take a few cards from there and give it to each other? And as a facilitator, here's something fun. If you had index cards that had a color sequence to them, so somebody had, let's say, blue colored cards, somebody had green, someone had pink, it's a good visual that the more different colors you have a mishmash. And I say, all right, check whether a new sport emerges, and then we debrief. So if you go to the next slide, here's a potential sport that comes about. Imagine this. Rule 1, you can't hit below the belt without penalty. Rule number 2, you can kick the ball. Rule number 3, you can't touch the ball. Rule number 4, you can't swim into the next lane. Anybody want to take a guess of this sport?
Water polo, maybe?
Could be, but can you touch the ball? Rule 3, would that apply?
Yeah, you could touch that, yeah.
That was close. But here's the thing. Because we've mixed up the rules, we cannot get something meaningful out of it. You can try, and this is where sometimes you might say, hey, that's mixed martial arts, which is just a flavor of different ways of learning to defend, to attack, to subdue an opponent, amongst other things. So why are we doing this? Because quite simply, just as sports have rules and it's something you can relate to and identify, there are some flavors under the Agile umbrella, such as Scrum, that also have rules. So let's go to the next slide, Bob. And what I found was something very interesting as to how did Scrum reference rugby and how did rugby come to be as a sport? Now, Scrum comes from scrummage where the teams actually huddle together. And the philosophy there is, you know, your team should also just have a regular huddle just to figure out where you're at, if you have any impediments, what's next. So here's a little snippet I got. Rugby student Bill Webb Ellis at 17 inaugurates a new game whose rules will be codified in 1839. Playing soccer for the 256-year-old college in East Warwickshire, if I pronounce that correctly, Ellis sees that the clock is running out with his team behind. So he scoops up the ball and runs with it in defiance of the rules. And guess what? That's how rugby was formed, in defiance of the rules. So it's not that you cannot necessarily defy a rule, but you might come up with something else, and it could be favorable. It may be unfavorable. And given that we're in 2021, rugby is still popular in some parts of the world. Something has emerged, something is benefiting people. So let's move on, Bob. So again, with the 9-year-olds, I get reference to LOL dolls and surprises if you're familiar with what kids play with nowadays at that time. And is it LOL and on caps or lowercase? Is it Scrum or Scrum? What's the subtlety here? What's going on? And again, I went back a little bit and I said, hey, look at the Scrum development process. It's capitalized as written by Ken Schwaber. Anecdotally, and I believe this was a typo a long time ago. But was it a typo? And if it is, should it be title case? And the more recent editions started just having what you see on the right, in lowercase. And again, if you notice, the rules of the game, that's the first thing we see on the front page. The definitive guide to Scrum, the rules of the game. Next one, Bob. So here's what really matters, and I do this for fun. When people say, tell me about Scrum, and it's capitalized, I say it means some children run under mommy when it's capitalized, because it's not an acronym. So just keep it to lowercase. And it's interesting because people will still argue about this. But you know what? Historically, it was both uppercase as well as lowercase. So next one, Bob. So here's another popular one. Is it a methodology or a framework? Today, if you were to go to Agile conferences, particularly Scrum conferences, you'll definitely hear it being referenced as a framework. And people get a little defensive at times as well to why and what's the difference. A methodology comes across as being something more prescriptive, something a doctor would write as a script for you, and here, this is what you need to take for feeling better. These are the meds. Whereas a framework seems to be a little bit more flexible in what it does. But again, interestingly, if you look historically, Scrum methodology, it was capitalized and it was methodology. And here it is, it's something cyclical, intended to be collaborative, but they don't have all the events or the artifacts really listed this way. So Scrum certainly evolved from this state here. So let's move on, Bob, next one. So what really matters, again, no two teams that you see, again, within your organization, or perhaps even outside of where you work, are going to be the same. And the common reference is to the game of chess. Chess can be played so differently every time, but there are still rules, right? It's a very elaborate game, but you have a certain number of spots. You have a certain number of people in the first row and then behind. And the queen has the most flexibility, whereas the pawn can only work a certain way. A horse does it a certain way, as an elephant, and so forth. So just remember one thing. There are boundaries in Scrum, and the members can actually be very creative in using that to their advantage. Scrum will say, hey, you need something no more than 4 weeks of a timeline where you produce something and showcase something. It's up to the organization and the team to figure out, is it a 1 week cycle, 2 weeks, 3, 4, so on and so forth. So those are the boundaries there. And again, this is a very popular certification question as well. Scrum methodology, is it a framework? If you're getting into your CSMs or PSMs, you might eventually run into this question as well. Next one, Bob.
And when I talk to my teams, a lot of times I'll say that Scrum as a framework, really, if you think about driving a car where there's guardrails, pretty much where you're free to drive the car anywhere you want, but then there's guardrails to keep you from really hurting yourself. And so that, that's how I look at that, as far as being not too prescriptive, but just enough to keep you on the road and not hurt.
That's a good one. So look at this. In 2010, the Scrum Guide actually had tips or pointers. For example, the first one I see, product owner can be a team member also doing development work. This additional responsibility may cut into the product owner's ability to work with stakeholders. However, the product owner can never be the Scrum Master. So we've got a tip and we've got a rule there. What's the second one saying? When a team begins Scrum, 2-week sprints allow it to learn without wallowing in uncertainty. Sprints of this length can be synchronized with other teams by adding 2 increments together. And the third tip, usually only 60 to 70% of the total sprint backlog will be devised in the sprint planning meeting. The rest is stubbed out for later detailing or given large estimates that will be decomposed later in the sprint. How interesting, because we look for best practices, we look for better practices, and these are debatable and argumentative. And it's interesting because today, if you look at industry standards, the most popular length of a sprint is indeed 2 weeks, then 3, then 4, and then 1. But there was a time the Scrum Guide actually offered these things, and eventually they went away. So next one slide. Again, what really matters
Sure,
is...
I just want to add to that first tip. I like that a lot, because I
sure.
encounter this question all the time, especially with new teams where the product owner thinks they can be the Scrum Master. And I would always come back when they have that question. I'd say, well, who's going to protect the team? If you're the product owner, you're driving the team, the Scrum Master is supposed to protect the team, so you can't be both. And that argument usually is enough to kind of let them understand that they do need to have 2 different people. But it happens a lot because business wants to save money. They don't want to spend the budget on having 2 people as part of the process, but they really do need it.
Right. And to supplement what you said, I would also say, if you're looking for someone having those skill sets, you should probably look into getting an Agile coach or a Scrum coach who can then help separate those and look for the true people who would take on those responsibilities. So, hey, what really matters is that there isn't any so-called best practice or a set of best practices for Scrum. There can certainly be better practices. And this is, again, getting into the framework philosophy. 2 teams may not be the same, but they're still working within the guardrails or boundaries of creativity of the rules that we have. So this is an older historic Scrum Guide snippet below, and I'll just read out the second paragraph. For those of us working on a revision to the Scrum Guide, this meant that all tips, optional practices, and techniques should be removed from this document. This was done along with refining some language to correct some long-standing misunderstandings about Scrum. So Scrum was always supposed to be simple, but there were also many misinterpretations, and there still remain some in the industry. So they started getting rid of tips as well.
Which is sad, because working in the different teams that I've had, the executives always want best practices. You're probably experienced that same thing. Like, give me a list of best practices. And I always turn that request into, can we call it recommended practices? Because the minute you say something's the best, it kind of tells the team, don't bother, don't try anything else, because we already know the best. And so, but what you want to do is allow the team to actually come up with their own way of doing it. That's the power of Scrum. And so by calling something the best, you're kind of saying to the team, hey, just do it this way. So it's just a little thing that always comes up, because management usually wants to come up with the best way to do everything.
Right. I'm so torn. I agree with what Bob said. If you can empower people and have them do this organically, that's great. And then I missed the part where there were some things that were so specific. I said, aha, look, Nitin's recommendations and best practices marry right up here. you know. So it's a mix, but try to empower the team. So let's look a little bit into artifacts. Where did these go? Release planning was removed in 2011. Burn downs were also removed at that time. Velocity, our ever favorite subject, also removed. And there was minimal mention of it in the prior edition. So if you go to the peekaboo, next click, this is a character that my kids enjoy. Peekaboo, I see you. It's really about someone kind of hiding in the distance and then revealing themselves and then disappearing all of a sudden. And in the next slide, we get into what really matters with these things. Release planning is certainly valuable to do in Scrum if you so choose to do so, but isn't a requirement. And this can really throw people off. I see this where you're either starting up a new team or you're a startup and you don't really need to do a release plan. You just want to get started and head in a certain direction. You could still do that with Scrum. And sometimes some releases aren't even driven by a deadline. There could be some organizations or products that say, hey, we have certain features we want to tackle. And when the feature is ready to be released, we'll release it. It's as simple as that. It's not that they're not disciplined, they're not focused, they're not being professional. It's just a slightly different philosophy. But as a formal Scrum artifact, the release planning was removed. And yes, the dev team is supposedly building a potentially releasable increment every sprint. So if you think about it, every dev cycle at the end of it could be considered some form of sprint planning and release planning at the same time.
And to add to that, Nitin, with release planning, I find if you're working with a team that's transitioning from waterfall, where they're used to having that hard, fast plan in hand, release planning is a good bridge, because what you do is you say, this is what we think we're going to do today. Tomorrow, it's definitely going to change. But then you can actually start laying out when particular functionality could potentially be delivered throughout the year. By looking at your backlog and then laying it into the different upcoming sprints, you get an idea. But I guarantee it, and you always say this, you guarantee to the business that it will change, but at least they'll get an idea for what they're spending their money about. It's a very powerful tool, something that I use in the bank environment quite a bit.
Agreed. I use this at a data center as well. But just to supplement what you said, we had a multitude of epics that were just laid out, and we did some form of storyboarding to figure out when would a big chunk or several features be released, when do we anticipate it coming out. That helps. At a bank, I did something similar where we did what's called the optimist and the pessimist exercise, where we had the dev team just estimate epics. And I said, okay, this is what you think it is. And as an optimist, let me just reduce those epic points by one set for everything. That shifted the timeline. And then I said, let me be a pessimist at the same time and just bump up all the points again, categorically for everything.
Are you drawing on like PERT to do that? Are you drawing on like a weighted mean of estimation, like in the PERT approach, the PERT performance evaluation for estimation?
I'm doing something simpler. What I'm simply doing is I'm using the Fibonacci sequence. So I'll go bottom up. Typically, you get 1 point, 2 point, 3, 5, 8, and so on and so forth. I said, if you have a set of features or epics, let's say you start with a number 13 or number 20, it's high, right? And in that same sequence, what comes after 20, depending what people want to use, I I just increase it by that sequence amount arbitrarily, but
We
consistently.
use Fibonacci weighting in our scrums for development. For sure, it's actually a pretty good way to do it. It's more simplified than a weighted mean, for sure.
Yeah, there are different ways of it. The idea being, what could you give to leadership or just to the team? Hey, if something got delayed, what could be a potential timeline? Or if you really did well, again, what's the optimistic timeline? Because a lot of people have the traditional way of thinking, hey, when can I get this done? When can I guesstimate this? If you're at a user story level, typically your product backlog items, and you have several sprints that you've done, you've got your velocity, you can get a good prediction. But when it comes to something really big or something that the team necessarily hasn't started, or they're being moved to a different program or area, that's another way of looking at it as well. But I like what you're doing as well. Use some model, whatever it is, that's meaningful and that you can discuss and just showcase the timelines there. Anyway,
Just a warning. Just a warning when if you do release planning. I had a team that estimated some stories at 100 points. Like if you follow, the Fibonacci, usually it stops at 100. Now the problem with that was those 100-point stories are actually 500-point or maybe 800-point stories. So what we were doing was giving the business a false sense of when something could be delivered. Let's say the team's velocity was 50. So that would mean in 2 sprints, they could do a 100-point story. Again, in a perfect world, and it's not really that way. But in essence, what we found out was that 100-point story was a lot bigger. So just keep that in mind, if you do release planning, that is a danger. Like if your team starts estimating a lot of 100s, you should take a step back and really start diving underneath that to find out, is it really 100 or is it 1,000? And
right, because they're not
that way you won't get surprised.
They're not decomposing it far enough.
Yes, exactly.
That's the problem we have a great deal. In fact, we don't even allow stories to be that heavy. If they are, it's an immediate red flag that we would say, no, let's go back and start snipping this. And
yes, that's what you're doing is perfect. I fell into that trap, and then I had to explain my way out of it. But yeah, we said 100, but we really didn't know what it was. That's the conversation we had with management.
Right. Yeah, guesstimate. Let's move on very quickly because there are other things to cover as well. Burn downs, a great visual in how the work is being spent, or the time is being spent, and where we're at. And this was also removed. So it's not that you could not use burn downs or burn ups. And a lot of dev teams still use this. And just some food for thought, how does this compare to practices such as ITIL? Are they trying to capture work remaining or work finished? Scrum likes to measure what's the work remaining. Just like, how much work have you done today? I've done 60%, versus the question like, how much work is remaining? Do you say maybe 40%? Somewhat philosophical. So what's next, Bob? Velocity still remains to be quite a misinterpretation. People equate this to business value or value delivered, but that's not what it is. It's a metric that really helps the dev team understand how much work is being consumed and the rate, and for product owners to make better predictions as to when something could be reaching the customer. There was one person who was struggling with this concept many years ago. We became friends. I said, try a simple exercise with the leadership. Just open the Scrum guide and do a search for velocity and see what happens. And she thought that was interesting, so she tried it herself. And she came back and said, well, wait a minute, I don't even find anything. Is there something wrong? Am I doing something incorrect? I said, no. They removed velocity from the Scrum guide, and they did so intentionally. And again, Ken Schwaber's got a very interesting thoughtful blog. It's called Waste Not, if you were to look it up. He writes a little bit more about this. If you were starting up with a new team, and I did this once very quickly, I'm going a bit off track. There was so much happening, and I actually told them not to worry about velocity and not to estimate any of the work they were doing for a sprint or two. And that was very confusing for people at first. One person came up and thanked me profusely and said, "Oh my God, thank you so much, because this has always been a piece of conflict with the team." And eventually, as the team gets better, then we figured out a model to do that. So very quickly, Scrum Master.
All right, I have
Here's a quick quiz.
we have a online poll. We're going to try this. Hopefully, we'll be successful.
Without revealing the answers.
It's not.
Everybody, close your eyes.
All right. All right. So this is an online poll. It's 2 questions. I'm going to launch it. And if you guys could put true or false for question number 1, is the Scrum Master needed in the daily Scrum? And question number 2, is the product owner needed at the daily Scrum? And so we're cutting 50-50 on the Scrum Master. Definitely the product owner doesn't, nobody wants the product owner, but people seem to want the Scrum Master. Can you guys see the results as it's coming across?
No, can't hear it. Can't see the results.
No,
Oh, you
not yet.
can't
See the results.
You can't see them? Okay. Well, we ended up with, I'm going to end the poll, but I'm just going to say it just in case we lose it. We got 73% of everybody here voted. That's 52 out of 71. For Scrum Master needed, 57% said true and 43% said false. And so Nitin, do you want to answer that question?
Oh, sure. And this remains an ever popular certification and question, and it baffles people. And when I first got this, I almost fell off my chair. The Scrum Master actually is not needed for the daily Scrum. The Scrum Master just needs to ensure that the daily Scrum happens. And this is baffling to people. Wait a minute. Isn't the Scrum Master the facilitator, the coach? And who's going to get people addressing those 3 questions? And if you really read the Scrum Guide, and if you really get into it and you talk to people, it's really that the Scrum Master is doing everything to create that environment, maybe look at schedules, get the meetings going, figure out when everybody can meet together, and educate them about the 3 questions that needs to be answered, but also empower them so that if the Scrum Master cannot make it for some reason, that can happen, or the Scrum Master has been pulled away for any reason, because after all, they serve the organization, they serve the product owner as well, that the daily Scrum still happens. And a really scrummy tip, and for Agile coaches, is they sometimes disappear. They intentionally do not show up at the daily Scrum just to see what happens. And it's such a simple thing. It's like the game of rugby, it's a huddle. And the people who it's really intended for are members of the dev team. So people are very surprised at this, but indeed, the daily Scrum does not need the Scrum Master. Anything to add, Bob?
You covered it really well. I find that the Scrum Master should be involved early to make sure the team's doing it right. And a good clue is if they go past the 15-minute time box, that means they're doing something wrong. And with my teams, I have 4 teams, 2 in Poland. My Poland teams meet like at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, my time. So it's like, I'm sorry, guys, I'm not going to come to your daily Scrum. But what I do is I make sure they understand what they need to do. And I do watch it. And so the second question, the product owner is needed at the daily Scrum.
So Bob and Nitin, I just have a quick follow-up question. Is it okay to ask the question now?
Sure.
Yeah. So yes, thank you so much. Now, yeah, this is a question that's baffling me right now. Because I know that the Scrum Master cannot be in all of the calls 100% of the time. And I also understand the empowerment part where he or she should facilitate all the team members to do what they are required to do. How about from a removal of obstacles standpoint? Because Scrum Master plays a crucial role there as well. So from that standpoint, would you not say that a Scrum Master is needed at the daily Scrum?
That's a good argument, but the way I work with my team is I try to let the team figure out how to remove a blocker first before going to the Scrum Master, because if they always come to the Scrum Master, guess what? That team becomes totally dependent on the Scrum Master. If they ever have something that stops them, they can't solve the problem. So you try to get the teams to figure out how to solve it themselves. Then they could reach out to the Scrum Master. And if the Scrum Master is not there during a meeting, there's nothing stopping them from having a separate meeting with the Scrum Master about that particular blocker that might be slowing them down. And then the Scrum Master could then reach out to the organization. They could reach out to the product owner and help. But the first line of the defense should always be the dev team. At least that's my philosophy and how I approach it. How about you, Nitin?
So I'll echo something similar, and it also depends on where your team is. If you're just starting up or if you're really struggling, the Scrum Master role would be helpful.
Sure. Mm.
I would look towards asking the team how they want to capture impediments, such as an impediment log. Just as you've got a product backlog of work that's to be consumed, I've used an impediment log, and I've also filtered it to organizational impediments, because the dev team only has so much time and they're very skilled people in what they do at their craft, but there could be things that are outside of their hand. So certainly we want to give them an opportunity to recognize that, to identify that, and get all the help they need. All Scrum is saying is that it's truly the empowerment part. They don't need the Scrum Master just to facilitate the conversation. And as Bob said, you can always raise impediments with the Scrum Master at any junction. I personally like to empower people as well to see if they can get rid of an impediment themselves first. And this is something minor that I feel they can do, or maybe they're not aware of, such as, hey, I got a problem with this thing. I need to speak to someone in the enterprise. And then this is someone who was offshore. And I said, oh, okay, do you know the call center number just to call for help and just get this done? It's, oh yeah, but it's in the US time zone. I'm in India, I cannot do it. And I just did some digging. I said, oh, you know what? There's some local offices and local numbers in India. And here they are. I said, oh, okay, got it. So what happened is overnight, the person did a quick call, and before it was a true impediment, by the next daily Scrum, that was a non-issue. So you're kind of taking people at, and I think it's a matter of evolution and where your team is. But all Scrum is saying it's not a mandatory position.
One other comment about this is that, what I'll do is after a while I'm working with the team, I'll actually not attend the daily Scrum as the Scrum Master, and I'll rotate it around. And that's cool because then they're like doing your job for you. And it's the best thing in the world. So
that's a good idea. So thank you. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Nitin.
Sure. The other thing, people sometimes need permission, like what Nitin said. Maybe that person didn't know that they can make that call themselves. Sometimes people are used to asking for permission, and when you're a Scrum team, that goes away. you do things until you're told you can't.
Okay.
I love what Seth just said. I've been on a team where people said, hey, we need a tester, we need a tester, we need a tester, right? A dedicated person. And I go up and ask people, hey, can we remove the tester? Or can this person just go take like a vacation somewhere? Or could we just tell the team that he was fired, and he really wasn't? Because when you remove that, suddenly the dev team was told, yeah, sorry guys, you got to do something with the next 2 weeks. I don't know what. And guess what? Stuff got tested, stuff got delivered, the team banded together, they cursed me out for a little bit of time, like the drill sergeant. And it empowered them, you know. So lots of anecdotal stories. So shall we move on, Bob? Next question.
Just real quick. I just had to add this one. I was coaching a Scrum Master of a mainframe team, and they couldn't get a UI development skill. And I said, well, how about within the team? Is there anybody that's really interested in doing that? And he's like, whoa. And so guess what? By the next sprint, that problem was gone because they couldn't get the resource because it just wasn't available, but the team was able to do it and somebody wanted to. And that's the power of Scrum. You enable, you let people grow their skills. And that's what keeps them employed in your company because they're actually growing and learning. So that's really cool stuff when that thing starts happening. And so the second question about the product owner, we got 30% said true and 70% said false. So they're basically leaning toward the product owner not being needed. So what do you think, Nitin?
Well, the answer is no. Product owner is not needed. So again, this is baffling to some people. And I think this gets a little bit into what was asked earlier. Isn't it about empowering, maybe removing impediments right away, letting the product owner know what's happening? Always keep in mind, the daily Scrum is intended for the dev team to huddle, like that rugby team. The product owner is often invited. I think it would be certainly beneficial for this person to attend, but not needed. And I know we'll get into a flurry of stories and questions, but in the interest of time, I'd like to move ahead.
Yep. And sometimes having the product owner is an impediment.
That's also true. That can happen. Product owner, what's the status of this, or why isn't this happening? Yeah.
Okay, next slide.
So again, this is just a quick snippet. Right. This is just describing, the daily Scrum. It's meant for the dev team. The dev team members explain. So again, the focus is the dev team, not the entire Scrum team, the dev team. So next slide, Bob. So in 2013, we're still a bit far. We had some things in artifact transparency, sprint planning as one event with different parts. The first part getting into the what, the second part into the how, where members of the dev team are breaking things down in the product backlog items to sprint backlog items, just saying, how shall we execute on it? There's some subtlety on language on refinement versus grooming. You might hear, hey, we have to do some backlog grooming versus backlog refinement. Grooming has some very different dark connotations, particularly in Europe. You could just Google this or look it up. So with sprint evolving, it isn't necessarily by process, it's sometimes just the language. And certainly reinforcing the sprint goal. So with the 3 questions also, it's relating to the sprint goal. And we'll see that more in the recent edits as well.
And also to add to that grooming, I use that as a tip. Usually when you start talking to somebody that says grooming, that's somebody that's been doing it since the earlier times, not they're not relatively new. That's one of my tips. And then I always end up smiling and saying, we shouldn't be using that anymore.
Right. The Scrum values were added in 2016. A lot of people were asking for this. The Agile Atlas, if you may remember, which was on the Scrum Alliance site, had this as well: courage, focus, commitment, respect, and openness. We're saying these are not fads, but this is something we want to just embody for ourselves and our team. So let's get into 2020. So what I did was just picked a few snippets that I thought stood out to me. And here are what they are. The Scrum team consists of 1 Scrum Master, 1 product owner, and developers. And I go, yes, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. That's a lot of ones, but it's a win. I like to just make it clear that there's just 1 product owner. It's not a committee. It's not a multitude of people, one Scrum Master. And we want to certainly separate those rules and developers. I would have preferred members of the dev team, but they kind of elaborated and defined that differently elsewhere. The other thing was the Scrum Master is accountable for establishing Scrum as defined in the Scrum Guide. People are still looking into understanding Scrum from other sources or other texts, and that's where misinterpretations start off. So I'm very happy that they're really solidifying that, saying, hey, the Scrum Guide is the true source if you want to follow Scrum. Let's look at the next slide, Bob.
And sure, just real quick on the dev team. Jeff, I was at the launch of when they announced the new Scrum Guide, and Jeff Sutherland said that it sounded like there was a separate team within the team when they called it the development team. So that's why they got rid of the term team. It's interesting. It's an interesting thought because they shouldn't be considered separate.
In the sprint planning section, topic 1, why is the sprint valuable? The product owner proposes how the product could increase its value and utility in the current sprint. The whole Scrum team then collaborates to define a sprint goal that communicates why the sprint is valuable to stakeholders. The sprint goal must be finalized prior to the end of sprint planning. This was something empowering and good because a lot of people do not have a sprint goal. And now the Scrum Guide is saying you do need one, and this is the junction where it should be finalized, which is great. I like that. So those are a few of my thoughts on a few of the changes there. Bob, did you have anything on the definition of done that you liked?
Yes, it actually surfaced it. It's always been this hidden thing that teams kind of knew about. And what the Scrum Guide does now is it actually brings it forward and it makes it, and it aligns it with the actual increment, ensuring that everything in a particular increment that's being delivered meets the definition of done. I thought that was very helpful. And I'm getting a lot more questions from management about the definition of done, which I think is very positive as well.
And done is no longer in quotes in the Scrum Guide now. Many years ago in other editions, it used to be in quotes. So they got rid of that as well. So I think we're just about going to wrap up. We like to leave with a few tips, a few pointers. Go ahead, Bob.
Should we bother with the fist of 5? We only have a few minutes left, but I had a survey for that. But but this is a really fun technique. It's great. It's very fast. And if you're actually all together, if everybody's on a video, you could actually do it on a video where basically Nitin or the person facilitating would say, okay, how are we doing so far? 1 finger would mean, not good. 5 would mean we're doing great. And so people then, you go 1, 2, 3, and everybody shows between 1 and 5 fingers. And so hopefully you're seeing 4s and 5s, but again, you want positive feedback, but this is a really helpful technique. So.
It's also a good safety check. If you close your eyes as Scrum Master, turn around, or no peeking. All right, dev team, what do you think of such and such issue or this or that? You let them do that as well. So certain variations.
All right, we'll do some. Nitin and I are gonna stay on for 15 minutes after 7, but we're gonna definitely end this meeting by 7. Additional reading. If you're interested in the Scrum Guide, and unfortunately you can't get the old ones, you might have to buy Nitin many cups of coffee if you want a copy of his old ones. You would go to scrumguides.org, and it's basically in different languages. You can get a PDF copy or you can get an online version. And what I like about the online version is you can copy and paste it if you don't have the expensive version of Acrobat. Like if you want to copy some of the content in the guide, you can. And so this course, if you have any questions about it, you can contact Nitin or I, and that's at our different email addresses. And finally, the PDU code is this. If you want to claim 1 hour, you can also get 1 SEU from the Scrum Alliance for learning as well. And so with that, Are there any questions?